All right, this begins the trig graph unit. So we're going to be discussing trig graphs and more specifically, and most specifically, sine and cosine graphs. As you know, this unit circle, the points on the unit circle, and you know what they are from experience, 1, 0, 0, 1, negative 1, 0, and 0, negative 1. We know that the values right here, the y values, are your sine values for the angles represented by each one of these lines. And you know that if I had a point here, whatever y value was there, that would be a sine value. So each one of those points we're going to take and transfer to this set of axes. So we know that this is 0 degrees or radians. This is 90, but we also know that as pi over 2. And we deal a lot more with radians than we do with degrees. So this over here is pi, or 180, and this is 3 pi over 2, or 270, and this is 2 pi as well as 0, or 360 degrees. So we are going to be saying, okay, at 0 degrees right here, what is the value of sine? Well, sine is 0. So at 0, this is 0 degrees right here, because this is the angle measure. The x-axis is your angle measure, and the y-axis is the sine of it. Okay, and y is the sine of that angle. So if I look here, I'm just going to do the basic values. All the other ones just fall into place when you do that. So at pi over 2, so that's this point right here, at pi over 2, sine is 1, so sine is going to be up here. That's this point right here. At 180, or pi, it's back to 0. And then at 3 pi over 2, it's down to negative 1. And at 2 pi, it's back to 0. Now if I go even farther, because you know this is a circle, and it does go around and around, so this is going to repeat and repeat. So the next would be 450, or 5 pi over 2, that's here, etc. would be, the next one would be there. And even if we went backwards, negative 90 here would be at negative 1. So this would be your basic sine curve. So we're basically just taking all the sine values from the unit circle and putting them here and forgetting about cosine. Cosine, if I just switch colors here, cosine of 0 is 1, and cosine of pi over 2 is 0. So the sine and the cosine curve, if I just transfer the cosine values here, they're exactly the same curve, just shifted over a little. So sine and cosine are going to be very, very similar and very, very basic, but you know, it's good to know where they come from. So looking at the sine and cosine curve, there are a bunch of definitions that you have to be aware of and formulas that we're going to be using throughout this unit. So the midline. So midline, let's just stay up here and looking at this. The midline is the line that the graph repeats around. So right now the x-axis is the midline because it creates a mountain and a valley, 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 all around this midline. So that's what that is. The formula, if you can't figure it out from the graph, is the highest value plus the lowest value divided by 2. So in this one it would be 1 plus 1, negative 1, divided by 2, which would be 0, and that is the x-axis. Amplitude is the height of the graph from the midline. So this is the midline right here. How high is the graph? Well, in this case, the graph here is 1. Okay. If you can't figure that out, again, it's very similar to the midline formula, but it's subtraction. And its amplitude is always positive because it is height. Frequency, the number of times a graph repeats over an interval. So how many times, if I say between 0 and 2 pi, how many times does the graph repeats? You'll have to count. We'll go through that, obviously, in more. We'll go over this in more detail. Period, how long it takes to make one complete cycle. So in our case, we're going to go over that. It is 2 pi. But the formula we use for period is 2 pi over b, where b is the frequency between 0 and 2 pi. So b, how many times the graph repeats between 0 and 2 pi, goes down here at the down here at the bottom, divided by b. And the phase shift, the horizontal phase shift, it's moving to the left or to the right. Okay, so this is a parent sine graph to begin with. We have y equals sine x, so anything, if we put anything on there, 2's and negatives and all that stuff, it's no longer the parent graph. So this is the basic sine graph, and these are the pieces that go along with it. It is an odd function, meaning it's reflected through the origin. The amplitude is 1. We just talked the height of the graph is 1 from the midline. The period is 2 pi. It takes 2 pi to do a mountain and a valley. That's what a sine graph is. It always has a mountain and a valley part. And those two pieces together make the whole graph. So it takes between one cycle between 0 and 2 pi. You get one of those. The domain is all the real numbers because, you can put any value in for x and it works. The range, however, is the highest, well, the lowest it gets is -1, and the highest it gets is +1 with the square bracket, so it's including those values. And the graph begins at the midline on the y-axis. So what I'm trying to say is, if you want to recognize a sine curve, it always starts on the shoreline. So if you picture this being like the beach, it starts on the beach and then does its mountain and valleys from there. Okay, cosine graph, exactly the same graph, exactly the same things. The only difference is it's an even function. It's reflected, it has symmetry through the origin, through the y-axis. Okay, if it kept going, you could see that. The amplitude is 1, exactly all the same things. The only difference real difference, besides the even and odd thing, between sine and cosine is cosine begins at the maximum. So the highest possible value we could get is 1 for cosine, and that's where it starts. So it really is only a valley. Or if it was upside down, it would be a mountain. But that's, it has to go down. So it starts at the max, ends at the max. Or if it starts at the min and ends at the min, it might be flipped around. So that's the major difference between sine and cosine. So we have to determine each one of those pieces from a graph. So in order to do that, we have to use our formulas or just try to figure it out from there. So we look at this one. The first thing we want to find is the midline. Okay, so where's the middle? Now maybe you can see that the midline is there at y equals 1, or maybe you can't. If you can't, use the formula. Okay, the formula for the midline is the max plus the min divided by 2. It's basically the average of the max and the min. So it's the highest value, the lowest value you could have. You want to find the middle of that. So it's 2 over 2, which is 1. So technically, if I'm looking for a midline, excuse me, awesome drawing right there. If I'm looking for a midline, it's a line, so it's y equals 1. That's the midline. The amplitude is the height from the midline. So if we look here, right here, this is our midline. How high does it go up? Well, it goes 1, 2. So that's the amplitude. If you can't figure that out, you can also use the formula, and it would be the max minus the min divided by 2, which would be 4 divided by 2, which is 2. So looking at this, is it best as a sine or a cosine graph? Okay. What you have to ask yourself is, if you're at the midline and the y-axis, does it start at the midline or does it start at the max or the min? So in this case, this one on the y-axis hits the midline right there. So this would be best as a sine graph. Period. How long does it take to make one complete cycle? So starts at the midline, does a mountain, does a valley, ends at the midline. So how long did that take? Well, one complete cycle was from here to here, so it took from 0 to pi, so the period is pi. So what is the frequency between 0 and 2 pi? So that letter that we were talking about up there, that was B. So there's a few ways to figure that out. You can just say, okay, well, if it repeats once between 0 and pi, it's going to do it once, one more time, so it's going to repeat twice. You can also use the formula. 2 pi over b is the period. I'll do that down there, so I'm going to go. So 2 pi over b is the period, but we know that the period is pi, and we just simply cross multiply and solve. So it would be b pi equals 2 pi, divide by pi, and b would be 2, which is what we decided. Okay, if you can figure out from the graph, sometimes it's a lot easier, but then other times you may have to use the formula to figure out what that frequency is. Is there any horizontal shift? Well, if there was a horizontal shift, it wouldn't start at the on the y-axis. It would be shifted over to the left or to the right. So there is no shift. The domain, it's always all real numbers. Oh, that's good. All real numbers. It says real. And the range is how low. So what's the lowest possible value? Well, that was -1. And what's the highest possible value? That's 3. So that's the range. For this particular one, okay, I didn't write the numbers over here, but if nothing is written, then you know it's 1 and 2, just so you know. Okay, so the midline, can you see that without the formula? Yeah, it looks like we can. It looks like the graph is oscillating, going up and down through that line. It's the same distance on the top. You know, it's the same there and down there. So the midline would be y equals 1. Okay, the amplitude is how high does it go from the midline. So this is the midline. How high above it does it go? Well, it's only 1. From here to here is 1. Is it best as a sine or a cosine graph? Well, you look at the y-axis and the midline. If it starts on the midline, then it's a sine graph. If it starts at the maximum or the minimum, it's a cosine graph. So since it starts low, it's a cosine. And the reflections. Well, if this was a real sine graph, it would have started at the max. So yes, it was reflected through the midline, which is y equals 1. What is the period? How long does it take one complete cycle? So this is a cosine graph, so if it started low, it has to end low. So one complete cycle, start low, end low, it took 4. That's the period. Now what's the frequency between 0 and 2 pi? I don't even see a 2 pi on here. I do know, because, you know, that 2 pi is around 7-ish, 7, so I know it's probably this much. But I don't really know how many that is. So this one I have to use the formula. There's really no other way to figure out the frequency there. 2 pi over b equals 4, and we just cross multiply and solve. So divide by 4. So 4b equals pi over 2. So it repeats pi over 2 times between 0 and 2 pi. Okay. Is there any horizontal shift? Well, it starts at the maximum on the y-axis, so no, there is no horizontal shift. And what's the range? Well, the lowest possible value is 0, and the highest possible value was 2, so that's the range. All right, have a good day. I know it's long, but the next one will be shorter.